Greetings, YouTube. Iris7i has made a couple of RPG-related requests, which I think I can cover in one video, even using the same topic. And the first of them being, how do I handle high-level play? Well, the best example of high-level play I can think of, at least in recent memories, would have been the Gamma World campaign I ran for the Overkill campaign. And I've discussed the Overkill campaign in a number of videos here, so if you search for Overkill, one word, on my channel, you'll come up with a number of videos, and there is a PDF of gaming notes for that campaign. It's just a kind of a phone book and some rules and things I created for it, which is available to anyone who so chooses to send me a PM with an email address that I can send an attachment to. That particular campaign, it was a post-apocalyptic setting on another world. I wanted to do it differently. I didn't want the players to start guessing where they were on Earth, or taking their world knowledge and giving their characters an advantage that they shouldn't have, because the characters themselves wouldn't have known. So I plunked the post-apocalyptic game onto an alien planet, a former colony that was part of the Terran Empire. And they started out as your fairly standard post-apocalyptic group, scrounging for resources, trying to make a buck. Gradually over time, they moved their way towards the capital of the country they lived in. And I borrowed this the country from the After the Bomb setting from Palladium Games, the Free Range. So they were in the Free Range, and they eventually moved to New Tau, and New Tau was the capital in my campaign of that country. And by the time they got there, they had enough money saved up that they could rent a house. It was a small, like a cape, a slightly large-sized cape, full second floor kind of thing. So they moved in there, and they started to work their way into the community at large, get to know people, find out who was what in the city, to learn about other people that were the excavators and adventurers and things like that. And they began to acquire a certain reputation for both accomplishing the tasks that they were given and doing huge amounts of property damage in the process, hence why they became known as Overkill. They eventually became known by the media, which helped spread their fame even further. And the rich and famous in the town, they began to be interested in them, and they began to get jobs from these rich and powerful people. Eventually, these rich and powerful people had connections to the actual government. And unbeknownst to the characters, and I don't think the players ever even knew this at all, that one of the missions they were given, it was a difficult mission to go to a fairly far-off location and bring back a very rare tree frog. It was called the golden tree frog because it was gold, and it was very rare, and it was very dangerous. It could produce something known as a death field, and it sounds just as bad as it is. And getting one and bringing it back was very difficult and dangerous and harmful, but they pulled it off. And they did it in record time, which so they had good resource management, they could handle a difficult task, and they did the job per the request, per the instructions. So that gave the government the information they needed to say, okay, maybe we can use these people for some, missions that we require to have a certain level of plausible deniability. So they got hired eventually by official government people, but very clandestinely, on the sly. Over time, the missions became more frequent, and they were still picking up things in the private sector here and there. They were doing things with a film company. They got hired to do guard duty at a big art show, mostly because of their fame and their fortunes that had associated themselves with a certain glitterati. So they were now starting to become movers and shakers in their own right. They had bought the house they lived in. They bought the lot behind it and built this big stable. They bought the lots on either side of it. They built a big training area in one lot, and they built a hospital in the other, partly for their own needs and partly as a free hospital for the community at large. So they incorporated themselves. They had a lawyer. I based the lawyer off the lawyer from the movie Night Riders, the one that Stephen King was in. Excellent film. I recommend it. So they'd wormed their way really into the social and political structure of New Tau and the Free Range at large. And eventually they essentially got to the point where they were the Avengers. They were not quite a fully fledged government agency, but darn close to it. They even had some ties to the military. They were given honorary titles, that kind of thing, honorary ranks, that kind of thing. Given access to equipment they could requisition. And when it came to do big missions that required big guns and resources that the government didn't have of their own, they weren't willing to put at risk, they sent these guys in. They sent them to go to another planet. It was they were in a binary kind of a planet system, to go and activate what they suspected was there, which was a division of super soldiers. One of the characters in the group was my friend Greg. He played Niven 7, who was the leader of those, unbeknownst to the people on this world. He had been, instead of being shipped to the right planet, he had been shipped to the wrong planet. Yay, military expertise. And they went there, activated this division, and then when they did this, they then airdropped the entire division onto the Empire of Humanity as part of a coordinated attack, both from the ocean and the ground forces and orbital facilities. So everything just kind of came all at once. And they were the vanguard, the spearhead of that mission to go in there and help decapitate the Empire of Humanity and finally wipe it out as a political entity, which is pretty much where the campaign ended. Now, it wasn't the end of the story arc. I could have taken it further, but the campaign just ended because the players had their lives had changed. We've been at it for 3.5 years. The original people that started the campaign, all of them were gone. All of the people that finished it, none of them had been in the original group. They'd filtered in over the years. But I really suggest basing high-powered characters and high-powered campaigns off of things that you already are familiar with. James Bond, comic books, the latter Harry Potter books, things like that, where you start having really powerful individuals and how they interact with the world. Don't come at this as though you have to reinvent the wheel. You don't. That post-apocalyptic game was very much a comic book, and it was cool for that reason. Now, the second question he had was essentially, or second half of that same question, was how do you handle running exotic races? So I'm going to cheat here. In that campaign, 75% of all the people on the planet were mutant animals. And the other 25%, like 22% of them were mutant humans, and the rest were made up of mutant plants, and last of all, it was pure strain humans. And of course, a few things that defied definition that fell into a very small percentage near the bottom. So there was no integration for me. It was no difficulty whatsoever, because everybody was an exotic race. But in a more straight-up game, you do have to deal with things like political discrimination and intolerance, legal prejudice, discrimination, like civil liberties that your characters are probably not going to have, and of course the social stigma of being essentially a freak in another culture. And I don't really think that you can go wrong, but again, looking at comic books and looking at a lot of the characters that you see in novels that are outside the norm. Because they are freakish in some way. But comic books are a great example. Marvel's Mutants. Excellent template of how to handle characters that don't fit in with the society at large, but the society at large needs them, and the characters themselves want to fit into the society at large. So you have that, that give and take, that conflict, that energy going on there to play with. So I'm hoping that this answers Iris 7 Eyes questions. And I hope that it gets other people thinking about how to handle high-powered characters and how to get exotic character classes, or rather races, into their campaigns, whether they are pervasive, like my Overkill campaign was, or whether they are the odd duck out in a world that is far more mundane.